Jerusalem studio. The Republic of India, which is the second most populous country in the world, marked on the 29th of January, 25 years since it normalized bilateral relations with Israel as part of its foreign policy's shift to the improving relations with the West, diplomatic ties that have provided both Jerusalem and New Delhi an extensive economic, military, and strategic relationship. To further discuss the bilateral relations and identify the implications on India's regional and global approach, I'm joined here in the studio by Ms. Paula Slier, who is the Middle East Bureau Chief of Russia Today. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Ms. Oshrit Bilvadker, who is a researcher at Bar-Ilan University. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of this relationship between the two countries.
Well, interestingly enough, India and Israel, despite the discrepancy in size, you mentioned that it's the second most populous country. In a few years' time, it will be the most populous country, overtaking China. And along with Israel, it will have 1.5 billion people. Interestingly enough, India and Israel have some common characteristics. They both got their independence from the British authorities in the same period of summer of 1947 and then November 47 and on. They both had major parties which led the National Liberation Movement, the Congress Party in India and the Labour Party in Israel, and they both had to undergo partition and keep up with a sizable Muslim majority and fight the adjacent countries. But even so, and we'll get into it a bit later, it only took the dissolution of the Soviet Empire for India and Israel to establish full diplomatic relations a quarter century ago.
That will give you, Paula, the chance also to talk on.
Well, I mean, just following on from what Amir says, certainly there was this relationship that was undercover over all these years. And I always find it interesting. There's a joke amongst Israeli officials that they say that India treated Israel as if it was its mistress, that it had this intimate strategic relationship for the better part of 40 years, but it never came out in open about that relationship. And as you referenced, it came out about that relationship 25 years ago. And that's why now, for the first time, we see an Indian prime minister who is in office that will be visiting Israel during his term of office, and it's hugely significant.
Ms. Bilvadker?
Well, I think Modi's visit in the upcoming July, it's a major step for strengthening the ties between Israel and India. And it was without a doubt that it will happen during his tenure because he managed to establish close ties with Israel during his time as the chief minister of Gujarat, where Israeli companies were an inseparable part of boosting the state economy and Modi's success later on.
Well, I'll give you a chance, Amir, to follow up on Modi. Prime Minister Modi has since coming to power in 2014, he really elevated the relations to the forefront of the media and brought about a huge change in bilateral relations. Also, because of various aspects of this relationship, Israel has become the #1 supplier of arms to India for a brief period of time, superseding the Russian exports to India. But of course, that changed quite quickly afterwards. But still, they're #2, big money going back and forth. Tell us more about that.
Well, it's part of the global picture because India always had two adversaries, Pakistan and China. And therefore, it leaned on Russia during the Cold War, while the United States supplied Pakistan with munitions. Then what happened was that during the rule of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, the non-aligned movement, which India led or co-led along with Nkrumah in Ghana and Nasser and others, the Congress Party was quite hostile towards Israel. But it so happened that in 1977, both the Labour Party and the Congress Party, which I mentioned earlier, lost their grip on power. And the Janata movement, which was right-wing and which Modi is a successor of, was too right-wing, in a bit fascist even, for Israel's liking, even though the right-wing Likud came to power at the same time. So it had to be the right time, the right personalities, and the right need for India, along with an enhanced economic power, which enabled India to buy what Israel has to offer, and not many others can, including cyber and surface-to-air missiles. And the relationship blossomed, especially between the aviation industries, Bangalore and Lod, the Israeli complex, so that now Israelis feel much at home in India and vice versa.
Nevertheless, Ms. Slier, when we're looking about the front of this relations, that was always a little bit difficult because of the concerns in New Delhi when we're talking about the way they would be perceived in the Arab world, and also now that even though the relations have significantly changed under Prime Minister Modi, we do see that he really is taking very strategic steps, whether it is flying directly to Israel and back or directly to Iran and back, not making any diplomatic relations as a tour of various countries to avoid any confrontation. Do you see this relation actually elevate in a certain aspect when the Prime Minister Modi will come here in the next couple of months, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu's expected visit in 2018?
Yes, I do, because I think what is particularly significant is not only the fact that we're looking at the first time that we have a sitting Indian Prime Minister coming, but that on his schedule at the moment is no planned visit to go to the Palestinian Authority. Now, as you mentioned, it's a very delicate balancing act that the Indian government is trying to present. On the one hand, it has to be very mindful of the messages it's sending out and its reputation in the Arab world, but on the other hand, it's coming to the fore and much more open about its close relationship with Israel. Now, the fact that Prime Minister Modi will not be going to Ramallah is a way of India kind of separating the two issues. We have a relationship with Israel and we have a relationship with the Palestinians that is separate. In the past, there's kind of been a muddling of the foreign policy, and many people suggest that the Prime Minister is very confident in India today, and he has in a way changed the foreign policy, that they're not doing something in private and saying something in public. What they're saying in public is very much what they're doing in private, and that is why I do think it elevates the relationship between Israel and India.
Ms. Bilvatko, when we're talking about visiting Israel, usually world leaders come and also go later to the Palestinian territories in order to talk with Palestinian officials and look how they can also contribute to peacemaking. India for years has been a staunch supporter of Palestine, of the Palestinian aspirations for a state and how they can actually integrate their foreign policy for that specific aspiration. Nevertheless, now that they're coming to Israel, it will bring about questions with regarding to why doesn't the Prime Minister also continue to Ramallah, and if in the future he comes to Ramallah, will that actually mean that he won't visit Israel?
Well, I think that the problem is Modi visit in July, skipping Ramallah during his tour is part of the way of the Indian administration to keep Israel happy, because there's a lot of pressure from the Indian side not to continue arms sales to China. And I think this is the active balance that Paula just spoke about.
Very interesting. Mr. Oren, how does this influence actually the foreign policy of Israel when it has so many interests both in China and its rival India?
Of course, it's a delicate balancing act, but China is also on the U.S.'s bad list. When the American administrations, be they Obama's or Trump's, speak about their peer rivals, they mention China and Russia, and then they have, of course, Iran and North Korea and Daesh. And India doesn't pose any threat to the United States. So for the United States, Israel can very well sell weapons to India. Of course, it competes with American manufacturers, but nevertheless, it doesn't have any sensitive political issues. There is one issue in which Israel gives some cover to India, and this is the nuclear issue. Obviously, India, Pakistan, and Israel are the three non-signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. India has exploded nuclear devices, as has Pakistan. Israel has never admitted, nor has it denied, that it has a nuclear weapon or nuclear military usage of infrastructure. But the Americans cannot condemn India while they're not doing it vis-a-vis Israel. So it's good for India to do it. And one other point, an Indian general, General Rikia, was somewhat responsible for the Six-Day War. He was in charge of the United Nations observer force in the Sinai between Israel and India, and he hastened to withdraw his force when President Nasser asked the UN to do it. Perhaps the crisis could have cooled. So for many years, Israel bore a grudge to the UN and to General Rikia, but this is now water under the bridge.
It is water under bridge in history indeed, Ms. Slier.
I don't think they necessarily contradict each other. I mean, India's policy for the last couple of decades has been to maintain relations with the Palestinians and at the same time have good relations with Israel, whether it's been behind the scenes or coming out more in the open now. Israeli officials have spoken about, if I can call it, lip service that the Indians play to the Palestinian struggle. And if you listen to Israeli officials and the comments they make, they're not particularly perturbed when India comes out and it says something that that in an international body is not overly supportive of Israel. So I think in terms of the close ties that Israel has with India, which I think is something in the region of $5 billion.
$9 billion,
is it $9 billion?
Yeah.
$9 billion a year. Israelis are not concerned about statements that will come out of India vis-a-vis the Palestinians. That again, they separate the two issues, the Indians, and I think for the Israelis, they see it, that India has to be playing the right cards in the neighborhood in which it operates. But at the same time, it is focused on developing a genuine, closer relationship with Israel.
Well, just to give a poll from 2009 to give a perspective when it comes to the population in India, 58% of Indians express sympathy with Israel as opposed to 56% in the United States. How much of an understanding does the Indian society have toward Israel? Is it some kind of a positive aspect that is reflected in this poll?
Well, I think the positive opinion we see in the street of India is due to the recent relations with Israel, if it's the technology or the military. And this is something Indians, and especially with Modi elected, the nationalist vibe it can be felt. And I think this is what makes younger people relate to India nowadays. But we have to remember that even younger Muslims today feel more close to Israel and are more willing to have a dialogue with the Jewish state, unlike their parents or grandparents back in the days. So I think this is it's a huge step, and we can see this shift happening with the number of Indian students wish to come to Israel to study and apply for scholarship granted by the Israeli government.
Very interesting. Mr. Oren, also when we look, let's identify India with a big Muslim community, of course. This has brought about also quite similar challenges as in the state of Israel when we're talking about cooperation between the two countries, specifically in the field of counterterrorism. It's the biggest field of cooperation. Tell us more about that.
Well, immediately after the diplomatic relations were established in the early 1990s, India became one of Israel's major partners outside of Europe and North America. And when one talked with defense officials even then,